Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, Boeing is back delivering Dreamliners, but why does supply chain issues mean airlines can't sleep easy yet over aircraft delays? And after the return of the Farnborough Air Show last month, did we learn anything new about the industry? My name's Graham Dunn, and joining me is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yes, good, and enjoying the traditional summer downtime of the airline industry. It's weirdly sort of post air show. There's usually a pretty quiet period of activity. I went away on holiday, and I think you'd you'd agree that it wasn't very quiet.
Yeah, no, I think I think it was fair that you presume that would be a quiet period to go away for, but I think in many ways it's been anything but, and we'll talk a bit about the order side of the post air show period in a bit. But obviously, we, as you mentioned in the intro, a really key development in the past few days has been the resumption of 787 deliveries. So best part of 2 years without those wide body jets being delivered into fleets, and in what is probably the best news for Boeing more than anyone else. They're back being delivered now.
Yes, so American Airlines were the first airline to take an aircraft from the resumed batch, which Boeing delivered last week. That's the first aircraft they've taken since April 2021. Clearly positive for Boeing to be delivering again, but also for the airlines who've been waiting for these aircraft. But I guess you would argue if there had to be a time to not take aircraft, a global pandemic is probably as good a time as that could come.
Yeah, that's the curious thing about this situation, really, because as much as you would, some airline CEOs have been heard over recent months to be complaining about the situation. There's also a sense you can tell by the way they're talking about it that very few airlines have been crying out for wide body capacity. As you mentioned, October 2020 was kind of the really dark times for the industry. So at that point, this wasn't a big deal. Clearly, things are a lot better now. But even saying that, you look at some of the airlines who are big 787 customers, and that covers, it's probably easier to name a network carrier that isn't than is. But look at Emirates, for example. I know they've got plans to use that type on thinner routes, maybe, but generally their current fleet isn't fully back in action yet. Airline like Lufthansa, they've got I think unusually among peers haven't had delivery of any 787s yet. I think they've got 32 on order. But again, they're not, the recent earnings season was all about this big recovery in demand, but long haul is the slowest to come back. And some markets like transatlantic are very strong, but clearly Asia Pacific is still a market that has a long way to go, and particularly on long haul, whether you're based in that region or anywhere else, not having that market is quite a big deal. So it could have been far worse timing for the 787 to not be delivered. On the other hand, there are clearly considerations around what these aircraft do for an airline. So sustainability being one key focus. If you're having to keep those old types in service for a long time, it's clearly not great. So makes the issue more pressing, and it does make planning harder, clearly, generally, with the ambiguity around when this is all going to restart. But I think the main relief will be with Boeing, and maybe the timing is quite good, because hopefully a lot of airlines are now looking into 2023, mid 2023, to hopefully be when they're back in action. But until China, for example, is fully reopened, I think that there is still going to be a bit of a gap in that long haul market.
Yes, and I think the other part of it is that this was a very specific issue to the 787. The wider supply chain challenges, which are putting pressure on not just aircraft manufacturers, all aspects of society, full stop. Those remain, and those aren't going away easily. They remain sort of challenges. So, and obviously the ramp up in production and delivering the aircraft that at the kind of levels that was being seen before the crisis, and which would match demand as the industry would go up, remains a big challenge. And I guess airlines will still be braced for a level of uncertainty in terms of when aircraft can be delivered.
Yeah, you're right there. And I think on the wide body side, I was listening to Rolls-Royce results recently, and Warren East, the outgoing chief executive, made the point that Rolls-Royce is obviously very, is a wide body focused in terms of commercial engines, and the supply chain pressures there aren't such a big deal at the moment because that wide body market's taking longer to come back, and that demand for new aircraft types, in pure numbers, but also in terms of the COVID recovery, just isn't as strong. But as you say, when we talk about supply chain issues, it's touching everything at the moment, as you say, all parts of life. But for the airline industry and for the manufacturers, we look at Boeing. We did a story recently just talking about, as one example, talking about supply chain issues affecting production of wings for the 737. We know that Airbus wants to ramp up A320 production, but the supply chain issues are a concern there. And more broadly, we look at MRO, and we've heard from Air Baltic, for example, that they're having to ground up to 6 of their A220s because they can't source the engine parts that are needed during the MRO processes. So there's just a sense generally in terms of the metal side of things that this really pacey recovery is perhaps not going to be kept up with by that side of the industry. And at the same time, we talk about capacity constraints, and we know too well in Europe, obviously in other regions, that these supply issues, also affecting labour. So we don't need to go over them again, but obviously we've talked a lot about what's happening in Europe and airports, putting caps on capacity, and obviously that's directly affecting airlines as well, struggling to recruit, whether that's directly for cabin crew roles, whatever, pilots or the ground handling side of things. So there really are a lot of things that are constraining capacity, and I think maybe there's a sense at some point soon, that rocketing demand, with the caveat that we talked in, I think, the last pod about the big economic challenges ahead. But at some point, that rocketing demand not only will meet those economic challenges, but also this kind of capacity constraint that may have an impact, and sort of quite significant impact, really, on the shape of the industry over the coming few years.
And I guess there is a sense, though, that for an industry that has historically tended to sort of rush capacity back when there's an opportunity, and there is a sense that these there's almost artificial caps being created by the supply chain issues across the board, of which aircraft delivery delays are one of them. But to some extent, that is helping airlines in terms of the yield environment and profitability, and arguably that's helping airlines to be sort of more cautious and profitable than they perhaps might otherwise be with this demand opportunity that is out there.
Yeah, as with many things with the COVID situation, is really a curious situation where after 2 years of being desperate to fly again, there's kind of CEOs now saying, well, we're actually quite pleased that we're not able to grow as quickly as we wanted. But as you say, that capacity constraint brings with it, if conditions are right, the prospect of higher yields, because fares will go up because there just isn't that ability to serve the demand. And Carsten Spohr, for example, during Lufthansa's results, talked about this and basically said the era of overcapacity is over. That range of constraints on capacity, whether it's on the metal side of things or on airports and staffing generally, will mean that will support strong yields for the business in the coming, certainly in the near term. And there's a sense that that's potentially a positive. And when we talk about overcapacity, Air France KLM, for example, in their results, Ben Smith, the group CEO, talked about from Paris how much they're enjoying not having Norwegian around. And if there's an airline that is a cautionary tale about adding capacity quickly, it's Norwegian on the long haul probably is a good example. So there are stories there. We know that Ryanair, Michael O'Leary, is a fan of talking up fares, and that's clearly, there's a lot of self-interest in this, but there is a sense that we are reaching a point where that capacity is just not going to be there, and that, as we talked about, that's for a variety of reasons, of which metal is a part. So it's an interesting market. Consequences of that, of course, could be that airlines want that organic growth. They want to see a way forward, and certainly one of the downsides to this situation is it does feel like there's a cap in many cases. So arguably that could make consolidation more attractive. We'll wait and see on that, because we're seeing some examples in the US, and in the past few days we've seen IAG firm up that 20% stake in Air Europa, for example, but there are clearly challenges in them taking full control there. But there's certainly in that constrained capacity environment, maybe that purchasing a rival or a merger maybe starts to feel more attractive in order to get that growth.
So we talked a bit about the delivery environment and some of the aircraft delivery challenges that airlines are currently facing. After the break, we'll take a look at the order picture and have a look at how Farnborough went. If you're enjoying this podcast, why not sign up for free to get the weekly airline business briefing delivered direct to your inbox every Thursday. You can register to get our weekly briefing together with any of Flight Global's other newsletters for free at flightglobal.com/newsletter. So welcome back, and just in the hottest days of the UK, hottest day in fact on record for the UK, slap bang in the middle of that. When else would you want the hottest day in the UK to be other than at the Farnborough Air Show? That was quite a hot one to be covering this year, wasn't it?
It was a bit, yeah. It does feel like those big air shows seem to attract the extremes of weather. I mean, I remember a recent Paris where there was some quite significant flooding, I think, on the sort of thing the day before it officially opened. But yeah, no, it was incredibly hot there. We were in the chalet where the air conditioning kind of a valiant effort up to about midday, I think, and then it lost the fight. So yeah, it was memorable for that reason, but maybe not so much on the actual order activity front.
No, I mean the air shows, the big air show, Farnborough and Paris, they have become the key point in the year of aircraft order announcements. We've obviously seen a huge amount of orders and deliveries over the past decade with one form or another, and the opportunity for airlines and the manufacturers to use these big global air shows with the world's media there to sort of showcase their bulging order books, and as a result we've been used to in previous years is going from press conference to press conference, announcement to announcement, a huge share of aircraft orders saved up probably for the air shows, and this year had a sort of very different feel, particularly for Airbus.
Yes, it was a curious one really, because clearly the airframer in most need of that for a big show like that is Boeing, because we touched on some of the challenges in the first half of this, and to an extent we got that. Another thing that kind of was a theme of this show was sometimes airframers kind of re-announcing orders that we already knew about, so we have to be a bit careful at times that we were recording stuff that was actually new. But yeah, as you say, it was a weird one, and certainly on the side of Airbus, I've joked recently that it felt like they almost had the wrong week for Farnborough in their diary. The Airbus's commercial, they're given, the order activity that happened immediately before and immediately after the show. Their commercial chief, Christian Scherer, addressed that in the one of their last press conferences, which was confirming an EasyJet order, saying that they've been doing a lot of discussions behind the scenes and kind of playing down the significance of using the show to announce things. And to be fair to him, they've certainly stuck by that, as we say, because we've seen quite a lot of activity since the show. But yeah, it was curious from that point of view, and because of that lack of big Airbus activity, a few significant bits from Boeing, including kicked off with a Delta order on the first day, which really felt like, oh, here we go. Look, we're going to get, not unusual to get into the thousands of commitments at these shows, but it never really picked up from there, did it?
No, I mean, that Delta was the largest individual order for Max aircraft. We saw bits and pieces that kind of followed. There was some activity from the aircraft lessors, probably not as strong as previous years. And, a lot of the business was top-up orders. So Delta's was a first commitment for the Max. And we saw Qatar firming up its Max commitment as well. But, whether that be some of the aircraft orders for the lessors or the deal, the EasyJet and LATAM's Airbus commitments, a lot of those were add-ons extending their existing order book, which kind of says a bit probably where the market is right now. As you say, we track the orders during the show at flightglobal.com. We try and cover the order announcements that we get there, recognizing that some of them are firming up of previous deals, and some of them are kind of commitments which will be firmed up later in the year. So it's these are never an absolute number, but as a guide this year there were 441 of those, and the Farnborough show in 2018 there were almost 1,500. So that illustrates the scale in which it was a quieter show, but there was some the regional airframers did bits and pieces with Embraer and ATR as well, but largely a quiet show yet. as you were mentioning, Airbus has kind of sandwiched the show with strong order activity both before and after. Including just a couple of days ago, Malaysia Airlines making a commitment for A330s.
Yeah, and it kind of just before the show, we saw the big three Chinese carriers place an order for I think around 300 A320neo family jets, and at the time you're thinking, well, China's not open yet. Clearly, there's maybe good reason why the executives wouldn't be at the show. So you kind of in some ways feels fair enough. But then, literally on the Monday after Farnborough, we wake up and Condor has, announced a commitment for 41 A320neo family jets. A couple of days later, IAG adds to its A320neo orders. Ethiopian announced it's converting 4 -900s to thousands. And as you say, then we have the Malaysia order. So none of them are groundbreaking, and generally this period has lacked those sort of kind of centerpiece orders that maybe all the airframers want. Although the China one clearly is a pretty big one for Airbus. But yeah, it's the period does reflect the state of the industry. We're still coming out of the biggest ever crisis, where a reasonable number of airlines aren't quite at the point where they've got all their fleets back in action, particularly if you look at Asia, and as we talked on earlier, on the wide body side of things, across the board in many cases. So the sense that it's the time to be placing those huge orders, and maybe it was an unrealistic expectation of the industry. But having said that, if you take together, if Airbus had announced all of that stuff that happened either side of the show at the show, I think it would have given the different mood at the show, I think. And I think possibly because of that, this situation, says a lot about the industry. The way the orders happen probably says, more about how Airbus viewed the show, unusually, because they've usually been big on announcements at the big air shows.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about the show, I think it felt like the most back to normal show that I've been to since then, in terms of COVID restrictions and COVID requirements. That it felt like a relatively normal show being there on the ground, which is really positive. But you are aware that it's still an industry coming back from this massive issue, and also that we're not on the cusp of are Airbus or Boeing going to launch new aircraft programs or new developments. I think in a lot of the previous years there's been, we expect to hear about innovations on the wide bodies with various aircraft that have been, to my mind, a surprisingly large number of new aircraft models or variants that have been announced over this past decade or so. But to some extent, the big issue to ask the airframers was about ramp up, about production rates, about supply chains. So that kind of theme dominated a bit. So you didn't really have, and that's one of the other things that quite often brings those aircraft orders with them is if there's a launch of a model and there's, accompanying launch orders that go with that. And, we've seen both Airbus and Boeing develop and offer new cargo models. I mean, there wasn't a great deal of order activity in that space, although that market is clearly clearly a much smaller one than the wide body passenger market.
Yeah, that was, it felt like if, any market was going to, stand out at the show going into it, did feel like cargo would be an area. But as you talk about that, there's a much smaller area of the market. But even so, it didn't quite, there weren't any bumper surprise orders there. But you're absolutely right on the, often the bumper orders with accompany a new program. I guess the closest you get to that is, the Max 10, where going into the show, there are concerns about the program, so Boeing did get that kind of lift with some commitments for that. But it was a show light on that kind of innovation on that side of the market. But on the other hand, of course, everyone wants to be talking about sustainability. And while we're a long way off, I think seeing a show where we get bumper orders maybe for a new aircraft type with a new generation engine, I think still people are very keen to talk about sustainability and that, from a news angle, let's be honest, the industry is working hard on this, but it doesn't exactly yield big stories at the moment. People know what needs to be done on sustainable fuel, for example. Everyone knows that we need to get to the point where we're ramping up commercial production. On the technology side, there were some interesting announcements. Certainly GE testing a hybrid engine at 40,000 feet. These kind of things that are all really important developments, but they just don't kind of bring the excitement you get with the orders. And everyone knows we're kind of still a way off these breakthroughs really having a big impact on the industry.
Yeah, I think it serves as a reminder of so as journalists we have our own timelines of how quickly we want stories to develop and how quickly we want things to move on, what kind of excites us and gets things going. But I think it serves as a real reminder of the scale and the size of the task the industry faces to really decarbonize, and for technology to play a big role in that. We are seeing developments of electric aircraft. We saw more announcements at Farnborough. We will see stuff on the fringes of regional aviation. That's obviously the opportunity where it can first do stuff. But that, even that is over the next, couple of year timeline horizon, and that's on the fringes of it. So much of the big step change technology we're looking at for decarbonising aviation, that is a long journey. So exactly as you say, I don't think there was anyone who wasn't talking about that, and people were able to point to progress. There were developments, but it is a real reminder of how long that journey is. You're not going to see overnight solutions, and that, of course, is why the airline industry is having to look at things like carbon offsetting, why sustainable aviation fuels play such a part in that near-term horizon.
Exactly, yeah, and I think if anyone needed a reminder of why these things are important, of course, as you mentioned, we were at Farnborough Airshow on the hottest day ever recorded in the UK, and as you say, everyone was talking about it. But that step change, certainly when we're large scale commercial aviation markets we're looking at on the technology side, is a way off. That's why, as you say, sustainable aviation fuel and offsetting to an extent are big parts of this. And it does create an interesting challenge for the industry, really. We've touched on before, but we're seeing the impacts of climate change in our day-to-day lives. The solutions aren't to hand at the moment. So if we're at a big air show like this in 10 years' time, it's going to be fascinating to see where the industry is, really, I think, more than ever, because the step changes that it's looking to achieve are obviously a make or break in many cases. And I think it makes it a really interesting industry to cover, but it's going to be an interesting journey anyway. And on the SAF side of things, I think the reason that is particularly important, and in the context of aircraft orders, talk to even the most committed sustainability advocate and airline, and they will acknowledge that airlines are investing in fleets at the moment that will operate with sustainable aviation fuel. But airlines aren't going to want to just drop those aircraft immediately if a new generation electric aircraft or hydrogen aircraft or hybrid option becomes available. These are big investments for airlines at the moment. These fleets are designed to be in place for decades. So that is why the technology is clearly really important, and why it is particularly on the larger aircraft side of things longer term. And SAF is sort of everything in terms of really making the difference. I think when you look over the next 20 years, I think that comes online at a pace that's really what's going to make the difference. The technology is clearly crucial, and in the longer term.
Absolutely. So whether it be 10 years time or 1 year's time in Paris, we will see. Lewis, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Graham.
That's what we've got time for. You'll find links to the stories we referenced, including all the news from the Farnborough Air Show and those aircraft orders we were talking about, in the podcast notes. And you can keep up to date with all the latest stories from across the industry at flightglobal.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review and don't forget to subscribe. And we'll see you again next time.